I must say this is my first ever youth Sabbath here, and I think it's such a cool idea. When I first heard about it, talking to Lewis, I was like, what an awesome opportunity for for the young people in the church to get involved and get up here and speak and read scriptures and present stuff. It's such a cool opportunity. And so for those of you who don't know, I teach high school math during the week. That's my job. I love doing it. It's a cool thing that I get to do. And I teach Algebra 1 and Geometry. Those are my two subjects. And it's funny because you go through and you're dealing with kids all day, and whenever you tell people like, yeah, I teach math, they're like, are you okay? Like, is everything good? Or you get to like, ooh, like, yikes. People kind of, I had a kid, he stayed after for detention on Friday because he's been late to my class like 6 days in a row, and I was like, that's enough. And so he stayed after detention. He's like, I have to ask you a question. It's like, do you really like to teach? Like, is that something you actually enjoy doing? And I was like, it has its ups and downs. I think that's true of everything in life. But part of what I do when I teach is, since I know a lot of kids don't like math, they kind of come to my class with this negative emotion. They come, and so I try to get them involved. I try to figure out how can I get them to be engaged in my class without just jumping right into like, this is how you solve an equation, And so I asked questions, like one of the most recent ones I asked was, would you rather have a spoon every time you need a knife, or a knife every time you need a spoon? And I always try to get a question that's good enough that they'll get split answers. It'll be like 50-50, and they're always like, mister, that's an easy one. We always go with the spoon. You can cut with a spoon, you can't scoop with a knife. And so I do this thing, and then I kind of start that with math questions. It's like, we'll put up 4 different graphs, and we'll say, which one of these doesn't belong? Or we'll ask questions like, put just this thing on the board, and we say, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And it could be anything. The response can be anything. So we kind of just want to, it's called low access to the questions, right? It's not asking for anything super complex. It's just asking for the students to get involved in some way. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of use that format a little bit. I'd like to go, and I'm going to go over 3 different characters in the Bible, and I want to go through their stories, talk about some of their awesome moments. And I'd like for you to try to think, what do all 3 of these characters have in common? What do all 3 of these characters have in common? The first person I'd like to talk about today is Daniel. The book of Daniel, when you think of it, if you're not familiar with it, it's this young man who gets taken into captivity into Babylon. And he's taken into the king's court, and he goes into the king's court, and he's expected to serve after his whole Jerusalem sacked, and they're taken over by the Babylonians, and he goes into the court of the king, and he's expected to serve, and he goes through this journey where it starts off in King Nebuchadnezzar is his name, has this vision and this dream, and he's expected, someone, please tell me what my dream is and what it means. And so the king is willing to kill all these people for them not being able to know his dream. And Daniel, this man of great faith, stands up and he says, I will do it. God will do it through me. Let's be more specific. He says, God will give me the interpretation and the understanding of your vision, and he'll reveal that to me. And so we see that iconic scene. It kind of sets the stage, and it's a place where we get a lot of our prophecy from, that vision. It's this statue with a head of gold and a chest of silver and a waist of bronze. It's this really cool image. And as you read through the book of Daniel, we have these iconic stories like Daniel in the lion's den, or the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego getting thrown into the fire. And so I wanted to bring up Daniel because he's an amazing person that tells us this story of someone who loved God so much and was willing to go went into the Babylonian system and did whatever he needed to do to stand for what he believed in and for his faith. He was willing to go up against and not fall into the temptations of the Babylonian system. So the first person I want to talk about was Daniel. The second person I'd like to bring forward is actually Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? Mary, we don't usually talk about Mary very often because she's kind of, like Catholicism and all these different religions look at her in this kind of different light. But when you look at the story of Mary, she's actually a fascinating, awesome person to really look into, you know? She is this woman who think like she was a teenager when we meet Mary in the Gospels at the beginning of the story. And she was engaged to Joseph, and she's visited by this angel, and the angel tells her she's going to be pregnant with the son whom they shall call God with us. So you're this younger woman who this angel comes to you and they say you're going to be pregnant with the Holy Spirit, and you're going to be giving birth to someone who they'll call God with us, who we know as Jesus Christ. And we look at that and we think, wow, that's amazing. But when you think about it, during that time in Jerusalem and where she was living in Israel, if you were caught in adultery, and she wasn't married at that time, if you were caught in adultery, you were in danger of being stoned. You know, you were in danger of suffering from severe punishment. And so you have this young girl who goes out and ends up telling her husband Joseph, and Joseph accepts her, but she has to live with this thing and live with the anxieties or the world that she's living in and the potential for anything to happen, right? You imagine how scary that must have been. And yet after all of the stress that she experiences, she has just these beautiful words. This is one of the scriptures I'm going to turn today because I'm trying to cover a good amount. But if you would turn to Luke chapter 1, you have this scary situation that Mary finds herself in. And yet in Luke chapter 1, we see this song of Mary. And it's such a beautiful song, and she has such powerful words. Because in the face of the stuff that she was going through at the time and figuring out, she still had such strong faith in God. And so if you turn, we're not going to read the whole song, it's a little bit long, but if you turn to Luke chapter 1, we're going to start in verse 46. And the title of the section is the Song of Mary. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior. For he has regarded the lowly state of his maidservant. For behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm, and he has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and has exalted the lowly." And so Mary goes on there, but just to give you a glimpse of just how awesome those words are and how powerful she speaks about God, who put her in this situation where she's dealing with all this stuff, but she has the most faith to just go up and be okay with it, you know, and live through that experience. And she's called blessed among all women, you know. And so I think she's just a remarkable woman of faith and someone noteworthy and worth studying. And so that's why she was the second character that I wanted to talk about today. And the third person I'd like to talk about today is Timothy. Now, we don't really talk about Timothy very much because we have the books of Timothy, but he's kind of this secondary character, maybe even a little bit. But he's this fascinating character because he shows up in the book of Acts after Christ's death, and he ends up joining Paul on his missions around the known world at that time. Paul was on his missions, and he comes across Timothy, who joins him on his adventures. He leaves his mother, he leaves his family, he leaves his community, and he just goes. And he goes with Paul, and they go on this journey preaching the gospel and shedding the news of Jesus Christ. And as you read through Acts and you see all of Paul and Timothy's adventures, and it's so cool. And then you fast forward and we get to the letters that we hear when we read 1st and 2nd Timothy. But to take a step back, he's mentioned in 1 Thessalonians. He's mentioned in 1 Corinthians. He's mentioned in Philippians as being the servant who goes out and he goes and brings letters and he's preaching to different congregations and serving the church. And eventually, by the time we get to 1st and 2nd Timothy, we see he becomes the head of the church in Ephesus. He becomes a pastor in that area. And so you see this young man who goes on this adventure with Paul, who ends up becoming a pastor in the church. And so in the background of all these books of the New Testament, we see Timothy going in this development of this story. And it seems like a secondary character, but when you look through his story, it's really fascinating and it's so inspiring. And so we could go through a list of many different characters, and there's so many different awesome people in the Bible that have these amazing stories. And we could read about Mary, Daniel, and Timothy, and they teach us a lot of lessons. And I didn't have time to go deep into their story or turn to the scriptures today, but I recommend going home and looking into them, doing some study on just, what their lives were and what they said and what they did, because they're great people that we can look up to. But I'd like to go back to my question, because that's kind of why I introduced the character. What do all of these three people have in common? What do all three of these people have in common? Well, you might have a list of different things. You might have a couple things going through your head, and you could probably come up with a bunch of them, and I'd be curious what you guys would come up with. But there's two things that I'd like to focus on today of what they all had in common and why I put this list together. The first is they were all people of tremendous faith that allowed God to use them in tremendous ways. Daniel was dragged into the evil empire of Babylon and yet refused to compromise on his beliefs. Mary, in receiving the most life-changing news as a young woman, moves forward in faith despite all the potential anxieties. And Timothy leaves home and family to go on a trip because of the faith he had in Jesus Christ and the gospel. He experiences persecutions with Paul, and yet despite all of those things, he persevered and became a leader in the early church. God was able to do amazing things through these three individuals, but they had another thing in common. Using historical cues and historical context, it is believed that Daniel would have been somewhere around 14 to 17 years old when he was captured by Babylon. Mary likely would have been a teen in her teen years when she was visited by an angel. And Timothy would have been somewhere in his late teens to early 20s when he went on his first adventure with Paul. All three of these characters were young and when these amazing stories were read about, when we read about these amazing stories about them. But God used them in spectacular ways regardless of their age. In the church, we look at these people as awesome heroes of the Bible, as legends. But to all of the youth here today that are going to be participating and that are here, we looked around and we're like, wow, you guys have so many young people. It is such an awesome thing. But to all the youth that are here today and that have the opportunity to read the Bible and participate in all these different things, it's so cool, it's so amazing. But it's never too early to start your journey with God. These people who did amazing things in the Bible weren't all old people who started getting involved after their lives were finished and they were established. They were young people who gave up their lives and stood strong for the God they believed in. Now, I know it's not easy. We live in a completely different world and have completely different challenges than they had during that time. And I know there are so many different things that we can be distracted by. And it's so easy to be kept busy. But you're here today. God is working in your life. And he can do amazing things through you. And even in today's day and age, it doesn't matter. God can do amazing things through you. And I would urge you to continue to get involved. Find different ways to serve and help out the church here at church. Talk to your parents and other adults in the congregation about questions that you might have or things you might wrestle with. Ask Pastor Lewis about questions you have pertaining to God or the Bible, no matter how simple or complex they might be. You have so many awesome resources to use. Do not let them go to waste, because you're here. And if you stick around, you are the future of the church. And ultimately, like the three amazing people we talked about today, you're never too young to start your journey with God.